YouTube. So King James. All right. So here's what I'm going to do. We're going to just bust this up real quick. Because here's the other thing, too. When you show people the truth, because they've been so deceived by lies, you show them the truth, they call it a lie. And then they show you the lie that they think is the truth. This is the Tudor House family tree, all the way down to King James. All these folks white. There were blacks in England, but there weren't actually that many. All right? There were Moors who served in the court of the kings, but they weren't part of the royal family. There were questionable relationships by certain royals with people. And then you had a bunch of people in history in Great Britain who were called the Black Prince, the Black this, the Black that. Black at that time didn't mean what it would come to mean for us. And for years, they had used the term black for almost anybody who they felt was the black sheep, figure of speech, or had dark features like a black beard, black hair, and things of this sort. Or somebody who did things that were out of the ordinary or contrary to the status quo and made trouble for the kingdom. It didn't mean they were skin tone black. We've been so wrecked by racism, every time we hear the word black, we think it's talking about one of us. We run around here now, we awaken, we Israel, I'm a Negro. Don't call me black. But then as soon as somebody say somebody else is black or something, we get upset. That's a contradiction. Y'all don't even make sense. We don't want to own the word, now we own the word. You didn't have a monopoly on being black. This newsflash. So look at all these, all these folks. And none of these folks is black. And here old King Jimmy down here in the corner. And here are his parents right here. Mary, Queen of Scots, and Henry Stuart. White as white. Here they parents. White as white. Here they parents. White as white. They all come from these folks or related to these folks. And you got more than one King James. So sometimes people are reading history and they reading about the wrong king. You got James of Scotland up here. You got James of Scotland here. You see, they got the numbers 4, 5, 6. All these King Jimmies. King James as a boy. Does that look like a black man? I'm just asking. Is that cousin Jermaine? Tell me something I don't know. That's all I'm saying. Tell me. Now, what folks, again, I say, they tell you, oh, these are conspiracy theories. You got a couple of reproduced bad images of King James looking black and some outright lies of them actually making him black. And then some of the pictures of old English or British and Scottish kings that look black. I forget, there's a word for the texturing of the picture. I can't exactly remember what it is, but it's something that they did, and over time, that's how the picture looks. But they got more accurate pictures than this in their archives and in their museums that are well preserved, like this one. Let's get another one. King James. Oh, he light-skinned. White. King James. His daddy, Henry Stuart. But they got a picture of him too that they've been jazzed up. But this is a lie. This is a conspiracy. But almost every picture of this dude is white, except for a couple that folks keep reproducing or some fakes that folks that made this dude out to be black. And then they even say things, so you see that word Jacobus in his picture, that means he is the tribe of Jacob. No, it don't. You can look that up and find out what that means. That has to do with his actual name. But people don't be looking stuff up like that. King James. All right? On a little depiction. King James in 1598. White. King James, at the age of 42, white. King James in 1621, white. King James, show enough white. Shut your mouth. Looking like a doggone candy cane. This is one of the pictures they jazz up and try to say that it's black and take all the stuff out of context. But they don't look it up. But it's easy to figure out what this all means. This is a drawing, basically almost like in pencil, kind of, or the way in which it's produced. So it gives these images because of the shadowing and things. This is King James. This was black. He's black. Now this King James is black. He played for the Lakers now, but he's showing up black. I know this for a fact. So, as you heard in that previous recording, we went over some pictures, and there was also a mention of the type of artist technique that was also used to make some of those pictures of King James, as well as some of the other medieval royals, which we will cover. But let's look at some of the history here on King James and bring out some facts about him. So King James the First, he was born on June 19th, 1566, at Edinburgh Castle in Scotland. His parents are Mary, the Queen of Scots, and Henry Stuart, the Lord Darnley. His relation to Charles III is that Charles is his 10th great grandfather. He's from the House of Stuart. He ascended to the throne on March 24th in 1603 at the age of 36 years. He was crowned on July 25th on 1603 at Westminster Abbey, also as James the Sixth of Scotland at Stirling Castle on July 29th, 1567. So his ascension to the throne in England in 1603 actually united what appears to be two kingdoms, all right, where both Scotland and England came together. And so then he married Anne, the daughter of Frederick II of Denmark and Norway. His children, he had three sons and five daughters, of whom three survived infancy: Henry, Elizabeth, and Charles. He died on March the 27th, 1625, at Theobald's Park in Hertfordshire. He was aged 58 years, 9 months, and 7 days upon the time of his expiration. He was buried at Westminster. He reigned for 22 years, 3 days, as the King of Scotland for 57 years, from 1567 to 1625. And he was succeeded by his son Charles. Now, here are some interesting facts to note, especially when you're starting to deal with history versus pseudo history. In particular, when dealing with Black Hebrew Israelites who have this fantasy notion and this revisionist history that King James the First of England, who was also King James the Sixth of Scotland, was actually an Israelite. And in particular, they say he was a black man, which is a complete fabrication and totally not true. And this is based on a very poor examination of historical documents as well as portraits. But here's the other thing: if King James was a so-called Black Israelite, and he was responsible for what they herald as or tout as the KJV, the King James Version Bible, so that Israelites who would have to learn this foreign language of English, would be able to understand the scriptures. Then why did he enslave you? Because it should be noted that if you are a person who believes in the 400-year prophecy, which is a false prophecy as well, and is now about 4 years late because it was never true to begin with. But if you're a person who believes in that and you hold to the fact, or to the idea, because it's not a fact, rather, but you hold to the idea that James was also a Black Hebrew Israelite looking out for his people with the translation of the KJV, then you also have to ask the question: then who was the King of England during the time the British brought their first slaves to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. Well, that would be James. So are you saying that your black Hebrew Israelite brother also enslaved you? Because he was king until the passing, of his life in 1625. So is that what you're also insinuating? And again, these type of historical facts are often overlooked to try to create a revisionist history by those who are promoting false doctrine. And so James was absolutely not a black Hebrew Israelite. He was not a black man. Could he have had some what they call black blood in his lineage? Yes, but it would have been so minuscule that it wouldn't have been of any note or where we would have to even argue or dispute whether or not this man was black or white as we judge people on today. Um, and then, furthermore, addressing the issue of the pictures that people often attribute as being evidence that James is a black man. Well, there is a medieval artist technique that causes those images to look that way. And at the time I did that first video about 2 years ago, I couldn't remember the name, but the name of that technique is line engraving. All right. And so line engraving is a term applied to a method of making prints and the print so made in which the design is cut directly into the surface of a metal, usually copper plate. In normal parlance, the word engraving usually refers to line engraving, but it is also used as a generic term covering a variety of printmaking processes. See print. The line engraver cuts the design into a smooth metal plate with a tool called a burin, and you can look that up. The essential character of the medium is linear, though shading and tone may be suggested by parallel strokes, hatching, cross hatching, or textures compounded of various dots and flicks. Now, it should also, let me note here that a lot of the strokes and different things that are added with these pictures are very dark. All right. So they do use some type of coloring when they're doing this, and it's often black and those types of hues, which is why a lot of these pictures are very dark. So it goes on and says typically line engravings have a quality of metallic hardness and austere precision compared with the spontaneity of etching or lithography, in which the artist draws the design freely. Often, however, engraving has been combined with etching or with intaglio techniques such as mezzotint on the same plate. And this is from Oxford Reference, which you can also just do a quick online search and you can pull up this very same reference, and it actually has more information than what I included here. But when someone uses a line engraving technique, it's very easy to make someone who would be quite fair skinned look dark because why? The picture would be dark. It's almost as if a tattoo artist who first draws the design and then places it on top of the skin kind of draws or etches over it into the skin to create the image. And so here are some examples of some of the pictures, as you probably saw earlier, but let's go over some more of them of why people think this erroneous idea that King James was a black man. And upon further inspection, if you look at some of these pictures, it's clear that you can't just tell what a person is based on stereotypes of what you consider black or white features. Now, if I was to look at this picture analytically and not nostalgically, all right, with blinders on my eyes, but being honest, well, his features are quite European, at least to me. All right. However, there are black people who do have these features. But when we go through the historical record and we begin to look at paintings and portraits, which were basically the photographs or videos of their day, we see very clearly that every artist depicted James as he truly was. And that was in color with fair white skin, not black at all. And so here's an example again of one of the pictures passed around on the internet and often embellished by Israelites to prove that James was black. It does not prove. Here's another example of that. All right. They also go to the fact that his name is Jacobus on here, which is just another form of Jacob, but it has nothing to do with him being from the tribe of Judah or a descendant of Jacob. It's just his name. All right. And so here's another picture. As you can see, this is another example of line engraving. The picture is quite dark where the lines and other shadings and things of this sort are. All right. But the artist's intention was to give an accurate depiction of the subject, not to tell you that the subject was actually black as if they were hiding some secret. No, this is plain right in front of people's face. People saw the king on a regular basis. There are no historians that write or annotate that this man was black. If you find such a reference, I almost 100% guarantee you that it's false and is relatively new. If it's not during the time of James's life, the chances of it being false are highly likely, like 100%. All right. And here's an example of a well circulated embellishment in Hebrew Israelite circles. And this is two pictures of James that actually do exist, but were taken by Israelites and placed on their websites and passed around and turned into memes to try and say, see, this is clearly a black man. Here's another example of this when they add their extra information or captions. All right. As you can see here, they say it's King James, black royalty. So this obsession, again, with color and race, this is something, again, that they've picked up from white supremacy, yet declaring themselves to be liberated and free and be woke and all these other things. But these types of embellishments of history show that they're clearly sleepwalking and are not woke at all. So to add these unnecessary captions and say King James clearly what you would call black, this again is a fabrication because he's clearly not. No matter how many times you say this man is black, you'll never change the historical fact that this is what the man looks like. When you add color and you have greater detail on a picture or portrait that is not line engraved, this is the man himself. This is how he looked then and always. And so, as you can clearly see, he is what we would consider a typical European whose phenotype would be what we consider white skin. All right. It's debatable as to whether or not he has Negroid features and all these other types of things. But this is an issue that a lot of times I think people get sidetracked on. And then in the current day and time in which we live, where you have woke culture at an all-time premium, you even have certain television networks taking advantage of people's ignorance and their desire for nostalgia and equality and all these various things, and they're peddling false tales. That's currently happening on Netflix with shows like The Vikings, in which they've made this actual historical figure, a queen, an actual like black woman, as if she's of dark skinned Hamitic origin. And that again is a complete embellishment of the history. All right. So, and they made her more than what she actually was, as if she was some type of dynamic warrior queen. And that again is not true. But these things are being embellished and done for the sake of entertainment. But a lot of times people just aren't aware. Another example that I'd like to present to you all that's also currently, ironically, on Netflix, and that is the retelling of the tale of one of the queens by the name of a Queen Charlotte. All right. And so here on the screen, what you're seeing is the Europeana article done about mixed race royals. And the woman's face you see on the screen is a portrait of Queen Charlotte. And I will put the link to the description for this article, all right, online, so you can go and look at that and pull this up for yourself. But let's read through this article just so we can get an honest view of exactly what it is we're seeing. Because on the Bridgerton show on Netflix, it has her as distinctly Africanized, so to speak, or what we would consider black. But was she actually as black as we say? Because when people say that this person was black or this, that, and the other, well, how black were they? Were they just mixed race? And they were just as much white, if not more, than they were black. And a lot of times it also baffles me when people pick up the same racial tropes, of slave masters and say, well, if you had one drop of black blood, you were considered black. Yes, by whose standard, though? If you're copying their standard, you're just peddling their same racist ideology, just like people do now, trying to prove their superiority as black people because they feel like they've been beat down and mistreated so long by white people for the last 600 years of white supremacy. So you're not more righteous by being just as unrighteous using someone else's philosophy to try to redefine yourself or identify yourself. So let's read through this article here about Queen Charlotte. And again, this is a painting or portrait that would be an accurate depiction of the person when she was alive. And this was a recent article that was published in October 21st of 2022. So just not even a full year ago by Johanna Fisher. So let's read through it. It says, in examining the royal families of Europe, one discovers the presence of not only Black people, but also mixed race people, both of whom have contributed to the history of Europe. One such mixed race person is the well known Queen Charlotte of England and Ireland, who married King George III in the 18th century. Charlotte's ancestors were from Mecklenburg Strelitz in Germany. Her ancestry is said to be German as well as from the Black branch of the Portuguese royal family, namely Alfonso III and his Moorish mistress. All right. Now, this is interesting that she's from Germany. So, this would also debunk some of the conclusions that some of the Ashkenaz, who people try to disclaim or disown and say couldn't possibly be Israelites or Jewish, couldn't also have what you call black blood in them, because you clearly know now from just reading this and a further search in history that there were also blacks in Germany. So let's continue to read. So, and just go back up to this point for one moment. Her ancestry is said to be German as well as from the Black branch of the Portuguese royal family, namely Alfonso III and his Moorish mistress. So this is a few generations back. This is not as immediate as you may think. And let's continue to read. It says, despite the fact their marriage was an arranged one, they nevertheless experienced a deep and loving relationship, sharing especially their love of music and the arts. Now, this is talking about her husband, King George III, I believe. Charlotte did face, however, the usual discrimination because of her race. So at this time, she's born much later than King James. She's born, I believe, in the mid 1700s, somewhere around 1744. And I think she dies at around 1818, about the age of 74, if I'm not mistaken. So it goes on and says she was at times described as ugly because of her prominent mulatto features. And yet, as can be seen by the paintings of the queen, these remarks were influenced by racist views regarding what constituted beauty. That would make sense because, again, this is during the time of colonialism. This is when it's at its heyday and the slave trade is very much alive. Great Britain won't abolish slavery until some time. In fact, I don't think they officially stopped trading slaves until after her death. All right. So let's continue to read. On the other hand, some historians have claimed there is a question about her African ancestry, despite strong evidence to the contrary. It is still the subject of a continuing debate, especially because of the implications it suggests. For example, her lineage would mean that her granddaughter, Queen Victoria, would have had Black heritage and that Victoria's future descendants would have as well. It seems obvious that issues of race continue to plague discussions about not only Queen Charlotte, but also under what circumstances future persons could be legitimate heirs to the thrones in wider Europe. It goes on to say Charlotte was an intelligent woman who, despite her looks, achieved notoriety for her positions on politics, especially her anti slavery stance and her musical talents. She bore 15 children. 13 survived into adulthood. She is even well known in America as a city in the state of North Carolina is named after her. And then, of course, that's Charlotte. Interestingly, there is evidence that Queen Charlotte may not have been recognized as the first mixed race queen of England. Queen Philippa of Hainault, who was born in 1310 in Valenciennes in France, had Black Moorish ancestry. So understand this, they have ancestry. Not that they're full black. So these are mixed race people. They're just as much the other race as the black one. All right. Not more of, and sometimes less of. She married Edward of York, who was just before their marriage in 1328 became King Edward IV of England. She became queen some 2 years after her husband's ascension to the throne in 1330. Unlike Charlotte, she was not subject to the unfounded criticisms regarding her race and physical appearance. Now, this would make sense because at this time, they haven't begun colonialism. So this is about just about 200 years or so before the slave trade begins, at least the transatlantic aspect of it. So it goes on and says she was instead described, according to the medieval writer Joshua Barnes, as a very good and charming person who exceeded most ladies for the sweetness of nature and virtuous disposition. It is ostensible that mixed race royals and monarchs were present in both past and present moments in European history. Despite attempts to erase them from the chronologies of history, painters, writers of literature, and progressive historians have made mixed race royals visible and important characters in the overall story of Europe. Today, we see also mixed race royal couples such as Princess Angela and Prince Maximilian of Liechtenstein, Prince Harry and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, and Countess Mary and Ferdinand Leopold Joseph, Count von Habsburg of Australia, or not of Australia, of Austria, pardon me, not as anomalies to the normative expectations for what constitutes a proper royal union, but rather as persons who have made a commitment to one another. Therefore, in recognizing and accepting the humanity and dignity of all people, we can share a triumphant story of mixed race people ever contributing to the long and rich history of Europe. Now, there's a second article that I also have here, which is a much older article from PBS Frontline, and it talks about the blurred racial lines of famous families, and it speaks on Queen Charlotte. And so we'll read a few paragraphs from there because there's some interesting points that I want to bring out that I think we need to hear. All right. And so it says in the author's note, this article, originally written in 1997, was updated on March 11th, 2021, with clarifications and to remove outdated language around race. With features reputed to be conspicuously African by her contemporaries, it is no wonder that the Black community, both in the US and throughout the British Commonwealth, has rallied for generations around depictions of Queen Charlotte, portrayed as she usually is in the regal and sumptuous splendor of her coronation robes. Queen Charlotte, born in 1744, who died in 1818, as I mentioned earlier, wife of the English King George III from 1738 to 1820, was directly descended from Margarita de Castro de Souza, a black branch of the Portuguese royal house. The riddle of Queen Charlotte's African ancestry was solved inadvertently as the result of an earlier investigation into imagery of the Black Magi featured in certain 15th century Flemish paintings of the Christmas narrative. A couple of art historians have suggested that they must have been portraits of actual contemporaries, since the artist, without seeing them, would not have been aware of the subtleties in coloring and facial bone structure of individuals of African descent, which these figures invariably represented. Enough evidence has been accumulated to propose that the models were, in all probability, members of the Portuguese de Sousa family. Several relatives had accompanied their cousin, Princess Isabella, to the Netherlands when she arrived there in 1429 to marry the Grand Duke, Philip the Good of Burgundy. Now, that would make sense because Portugal is on the Iberian Peninsula with Spain, and we know that they have a long history, all right, of connecting with both the nations of Africa as well as nations in the Levant, with a rich history that goes in it from for Israel in particular that goes all the way back to the time of Solomon. All right. And so let's continue to read. At least 492 lines of descent can be traced from Queen Charlotte through her triple ancestry from Margarita de Castro y Souza to Martin Alfonso de Souza Chicoro. the illegitimate son of King Alfonso of Portugal, and his Moorish mistress, Orana Madragana. Interestingly enough, I hope I said that name right, but interestingly enough, in a gene pool that was comparatively minuscule due to royal inbreeding, it was from Martin Alfonso de Sousa's wife, Inés de Valadares, that the British queen inherited most of her African Islamic ancestry. So it's even telling us what part of her family the ancestry comes. Not that she was completely Black or African or Levantine or whatever it is you want to surmise or think in your mind. All right, let's go on and read further. It says Queen Charlotte's portrait, the African characteristics evident in so many of the Queen's portraits, certainly had political significance, since artists of that period were expected to play down, soften, or even obliterate features in a subject's face, especially a woman's, that were not considered to meet the standards of beauty for the times. So rather than them have filters like we do today with our technology, the artists, since they were painting a portrait, just eliminated and fixed the picture up according to what it was considered acceptable beauty standards of that time. So that's what they did. All right. It goes on and says Sir Allan Ramsay was the artist responsible for the majority of the paintings of the Queen, and his representations of her were the most decidedly African of all her portraits. Ramsay's anti-slavery sentiments were well known. He also married the niece of Lord Mansfield, the English judge whose 1772 decision was the first in a series of rulings that finally ended slavery in the British Empire. It should be noted, too, that by that time, or by the time Sir Ramsay was commissioned to do his first portrait of the Queen, he was already, by marriage, uncle to Dido Elizabeth Lindsay, the Black grandniece of Lord Mansfield. So again, you did have Black people in England who sometimes were members of prominent families. All right. That's not a problem. But were Black people actually monarchs on the British throne? That's the question. And that's where the embellishment comes in, because that's just not true. All right. A speck of Black blood does not make an entire family of white folks actually Black, even though we know there's still people that believe that. All right. You are what you are. You should be proud of what you are. We're trying to prove you're something else for whatever reason that is. All right. You can be fair skinned and be Black and look white. That's what we call passing. All right. And even in certain parts of Africa, you can be Black like myself and be referred to as white based on a cultural designation or an ancient terminology, which actually means a shining Black skin or nobility or purity. All right. And that's sometimes how white actually means Black in the Bible, and not European white as we may think. But again, the Bible is not trying to convey issues of race and color as we do today. It's just giving you a description of the individuals being spoken of, and also trying to relate to you something that may have to do with them spiritually, because it's a spiritual book. Let's continue to read. There's some interesting information here I want to bring out. Thus, from just a cursory look at the social awareness and political activism at the level of English society, it would be surprising if the Queen's African features were of no significance to the abolitionist movement. So now look at what it's saying. It's saying that people begin to hone in on this fact that Queen Charlotte had, Black admixture in her ancestry. And it became like a lightning rod or motivating thing to the abolitionist movement, whose goal was what? To release the slaves. All right. And so if you had a royal person that had, Black ancestry, then that would kind of debunk the argument against Black people being considered beast or not fully human, because look, you have Black blood, so to speak, in at the highest echelons of the aristocracy in Europe. which was responsible for the slave trade. So if they could be royals, then how could they be slaves and not be equal to whites and other people? And you'll even see this used in more sinister ways by people who really didn't care about black folks, but they'll also use Queen Charlotte for their own means. And I think that's interesting because that even happens today. But you'll have, again, people who desire nostalgia and certain things will latch on to this, especially in the black community and among Israelites in particular, without realizing that they're being drawn into a racial trope that was actually created by whites who were very racist, in fact, by doing this and used it to manipulate them. And then they're going around repeating these things ignorantly, not knowing what the purpose of them was. But let's continue to read. Lord Manfield's black grandniece, for example, Miss Lindsay, was the subject of at least two formal full-size portraits, obviously prompted by or meant to appeal to a abolitionist sympathy or to abolitionist sympathies. They depicted the celebrated friendship between herself and a white cousin, as you see in the picture here. It is perhaps because of this fairly obvious case of pointed portraiture that makes one suspect that Queen Charlotte's coronation pictures, copies of which were sent out to all four corners of the empire, signified a specific stance on slavery held at least by that circle of the English intelligentsia to which Ramsay belonged. It says on this side of the Atlantic, the slogan, the Queen of England was a Negro woman, was weaponized by the Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane in his campaign to persuade enslaved people to defect to the British during the 1812 war. More than 4,000 ultimately did, making it the largest emancipation in the US until the Civil War. So, do you see how this was also used, you know, for the gain of the British, who weren't really sincere in their usage of it? But they did it to try to do what? Undermine their American enemies during the time of the British War of 1812 against the American colonies. All right. And so this is, well, the newly formed American nation, I should say, not the colonies, because they had already fought the Revolutionary War. And so this is what you're seeing, and you see this type of manipulation throughout history where people will use the fact that someone was black or either had black ancestry for their own means. And you see the Europeans even doing this to manipulate what? Black people right here in America. And so now a lot of these Israelites are doing the same thing with this information. And basically, all this talk about breaking away from the slave master and breaking the chains of oppression, you're just following the slave master's game plan. And you're not free from anything. You're just even more oppressed with lies. And so this is what it boils down to. I'm going to put the link to this article also in the description so that you can continue to read the rest of it on your own. And we're going to go back and go ahead and close the rest of our presentation out because I didn't want this to be very long, but I wanted it to at least be strong. So, what are we talking about here? All right. When we start talking about King James and all of these other things, well, I'll say this very simply in my conclusion. Blackwashing is just as wrong and deceptive as whitewashing because after you've given out your own pseudo version of history or scripture, you're still left with a lie that denies the truth.